Process, winner of 15 New York and Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights.
His philosophy and his thought and his spirit guided us and continues to guide us despite everything.
And that's why this larger-than-life statue was commissioned and installed on the steps of Essex County's Hall of Records. That and the fact that his early home was Newark. Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, remembered in the city where he was born and raised, and on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSEG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.
Chances are you may not know his name, although his work had impact on us all. And even if you know that for 34 years he was a major force on the U.S. Supreme Court, you probably don't know he was from New Jersey. I'm Raymond Brown, and our focus for this week and next, Newark's own Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, honored at last where his story began, as Sandy King is here to tell us.
Raymond, through all of my years in Newark public school classrooms, the name was simply never mentioned. While court scholars often hail him as a hero, he was largely overlooked on home ground. And yet, consider his education: Harvard Law, University of Pennsylvania, Barringer High School. But Newark is finally taking notice thanks to an impressive new sculpture and enormous praise like this.
Justice Brennan wrote more than 1,300 opinions while serving on the U.S. Supreme Court. And through those opinions, he literally transformed the legal landscape in which all of us live. Simply put, he was the primary architect of the system of individual rights that we all take for granted today.
Yet outside of legal circles, he is not a household name.
How many people do you think who will walk past that statue will have any idea who it is?
You know, I hope. You know, we got to teach. You know, we got to educate.
And in the city of his birth, at Barringer, his old high school, he's been virtually unknown.
Did you know who he was when you were a kid going to Barringer?
No, absolutely not. I didn't know him. I only knew one thing: playing football. But I didn't know who he was. No.
Some Newarkers might have wondered about the name on this park. It's part of the Essex Court complex where Brennan once sat.
I kept asking myself, how could someone of Justice Brennan's stature and enormous contribution to the lives of all Americans be forgotten in his hometown?
But thanks to Guy Sterling's idea,
Justice Brennan, we're gonna do it.
And Joe Dee's willingness to carry the ball, there will now be a face to put with the name and an explanation at the base of this statue of who William Brennan was and where he came from.
The notion that a first-generation Irish American could rise to the United States Supreme Court was, I think, beyond even imagining at that time. So our Newark roots, our Trenton roots, our New Jersey roots are very real, and most of our families still live here.
His roots may have been humble, but this son of Irish immigrants, the second of 8 children, rose to the highest court in this land and stayed there 34 years.
When you look at many of the issues that we dealt with during the 20th century, you know, his tenure on the court, which spanned from 56 to '90, that's really, in a sense, where a lot of the action occurred as far as the Supreme Court was concerned.
But the decision to raise this larger-than-life tribute to Brennan wasn't based on his longevity on the court, but rather his performance.
He was a larger-than-life figure. He deserves a larger-than-life statue. He was a genuine American hero and perhaps the most effective advocate for civil liberties in the history of the United States Supreme Court.
His law career began at Harvard. His judicial career in Newark on the state Superior Court.
Yeah, actually, I argued a case before the New Jersey Supreme Court when he was on the court. I lost. And he was wrong, by the way.
Later, the state Supreme Court, named to both by Republican Governor Alfred Driscoll, who might well have been surprised to hear his nominee described as
The greatest justice of the 20th century.
That from constitutional law professor Laurence Tribe of Harvard, who says Brennan was not just the greatest, but perhaps the most liberal.
He was really the architect of individual rights and liberties.
His move from Trenton to Washington and these hallowed halls came courtesy of President Eisenhower, said to have named him because putting a Northeastern Catholic on the court might help with his own re-election. But Ike may have gotten more than he banked on.
I think he probably did not understand what Justice Brennan would become, but from my point of view, it's one of the proudest legacies of the Eisenhower presidency, and I would hope that he would have thought that.
He wasn't doing what modern presidents have done, and that is trying to stamp the court with a given ideology. He later on said that he thought that Brennan and Warren were among his big mistakes, but I think he said it slightly tongue-in-cheek.
But whether Ike intended to launch a liberal crusade with his naming of Justice Brennan, well, that is doubtful. But Brennan probably would be pleased to know that he's been remembered back home. And though the idea came from a journalist on a mission and the statue site from Essex County, it was private money that paid for the sculpture created by artist Jay Warren in homage to a son of immigrants, Raymond, who may have changed life for us all.
And Sandy, we'll talk about how when we come back, so stay with us.
Not only a civil liberties advocate, but he was a genius, as he would say, at getting to five votes. And at the beginning of every term, he would famously call his new law clerks into his office, and he would say to them, what it's all about is getting to five. And the truth is, that was half true for Justice Brennan. It was about getting to five, but it was about getting to five with principle. He was not simply a pragmatist, he was a principled man who knew how to operate pragmatically and achieved more than anybody could reasonably have anticipated when he was first nominated to the Supreme Court by President Eisenhower.
Nominated by Eisenhower, but on the court through 8 presidents and always his own man. In fact, Seth Stern's new biography says it all. Justice Brennan, liberal champion. Nicole Austin-Hillery is director and counsel of the D.C. office of the Brennan Center for Justice. And when Professor Bernard Bell, with us from Newark, teaches constitutional law at Rutgers, we assume Justice Brennan is front and center. Welcome to all of you. Seth, let me start with you. You and your co-author have had really unparalleled access to many papers and documents that no one else has seen. So the question arises, is there likely to be anything in the book in terms of ideology, judicial philosophy, personal life that surprises people and says, wow, we didn't expect that to be the case?
I think absolutely there are going to be a lot of surprises and new things in the book that are revealed about Justice Brennan's life and his tenure on the court and how he managed this obscure corporate lawyer and state judge to become perhaps the most influential justice of the 20th century.
Okay, now you know you can't tease us like that and not give us one. Tell us one thing that you think would surprise Nicole and Bernie.
I think what's fascinating is how we tell the story of not just the success he had under Chief Justice Earl Warren when there was a block of liberals, but also the success he had under 2 conservative successors, the Chief Justice Warren Burger and then William Rehnquist, when Brennan continued to be successful at times frustrated that the court wasn't going in the direction he would have liked and was stepping back from some of the victories he had achieved in the 60s, but he still managed to build consensus, to build pragmatic solutions.
Really a surprise. I mean, in a sense, that's what has been the focus of much attention, how he continued to have the capacity, as I think Steve Shapiro mentioned in Sandy's report, to build, to count to 5, to find justices in the moderate segment of the court that he could bring along. Is there a component of that that surprised you, something about the way he did it that's surprising or unexpected?
Well, I think we look at both the success he had, the surprising success, but also the frustrations. There was a deep sense of frustration, and at times that boiled over. He had some dissents that were rather caustic in the 70s. So we try to reveal both sides of that, and at times it was counterproductive. He was good at building consensus, but he also managed to alienate some of the moderates on the court during the 70s.
Now, that I think does that surprise you, Nicole, that there was a sense of frustration when he was unable to build the consensus that may have led him to alienate folks, or is that something you suspected?
No, I completely suspect that he was a passionate jurist. So at times when he was not as successful as he had been previously, I can completely understand that he would be frustrated by that. And because he was so passionate, he wanted to ensure that the type of jurisprudence he supported, that he believed in, that he believed was really about the individual person. That's what he wanted to push forward.
Is the Brennan Center, which you work for, more committed to his particular judicial philosophy or to the sense of passion broadly about championing the underdog? I mean, which would you say is the nexus between the center and Justice Brennan?
I think it's really a hybrid, Raymond.
Why does it surprise me that you gave me a nuanced answer?
The Brennan Center is very committed in terms of the issues that we cover to staying true to Justice Brennan's jurisprudence. So we focus on issues that fall under one of two categories, issues of democracy and those of justice. And under each of those rubrics, we deal with things as varied as campaign finance reform, voting rights, criminal justice reform, racial justice reform, judicial diversity. And we realize that those things are really at the core of the type of jurisprudence that Justice Brennan championed. But we also understand that because so much of what we work on is really about the individual and promoting individual rights, that it cannot be devoid, our work cannot be devoid of the passion that was really at the heart of all that Justice Brennan supported.
And the center was started really by his clerks.
It was started by his clerks. At the time of Justice Brennan's retirement, his clerks, whom all have gone on record, and Seth probably knows this from the work he's done on the book, who've all gone on record and said that they just absolutely loved Justice Brennan. They loved working with him. They had supreme respect for him. And they decided that they wanted to do more than simply have the normal bust or give the really nice gold watch to the retiring jurist. And they wanted to really have a living legacy to him. And thereabout came the idea of the Brennan Center for Justice.
Let me ask Bernie, you clerked for Justice White at the time when Justice Brennan was on the court. First of all, let me ask you, apropos of something Nicole said, do all justices find universal acclaim among their clerks, or is that unusual that Justice Brennan would almost be universally admired by his clerks? I don't know if that's a secret you can't reveal about the court.
No, I mean, to the extent I know about it, I can certainly talk about it. I mean, I certainly have not talked to all clerks of all justices, but I think generally clerks tend to admire and like their justices. I think even clerks who go on to have a different ideological approach or different philosophy still tend to admire and tend to speak highly of their justices. I know of a couple of...
Did you have any direct contact with Justice Brennan while you were at the court clerking for Justice White?
Yes, on a couple of occasions. There was a tradition of clerks for various justices getting together and inviting other justices to lunch. So my co-clerks with Justice White did that. And I also met him briefly a couple times as well during my year of clerking.
Let me comment on something I presumed during my introduction of you, which was that in teaching constitutional law, there is a special focus, or looking at Justice Brennan's work has a special place in your pedagogy. Is that a presumption, or is that accurate?
Well, I wouldn't say in general that I focus on positions of justices that much, except inevitably you'll see that there are certain justices that are associated with certain philosophical positions, and I think Justice Brennan is one of the people that you most think of when you think of someone who has had influence over the long term, has a philosophy that you can follow over time and that has some significance.
What then is your reaction to the comments of Tribe and others who have said he was the architect of a liberal consensus and arguably certainly the greatest liberal justice and maybe the greatest justice? Do you think that's hyperbole, or whether you agree or not, is that within the range of reasonable assessment?
I think that's certainly within the range of reasonable assessment, and I would find it hard to disagree given the length of his tenure and given some of the major cases he wrote and major things he accomplished on the court in an atmosphere where for much of his tenure he was actually dealing with a court that tended to be more conservative is truly extraordinary and, you know, basis of a lot of law today.
Seth, given the benefit of hindsight, as you look back on his state court career, in retrospect, is there anything that would have predicted either the magnitude of his potential impact on the Supreme Court or the extent to which he became the architect of this liberal school of thought with respect to judicial philosophy?
My co-author Steve Wermiel and I looked at that carefully, trying to see were there those hints there. And there are some cases you could point to from his tenure, both as a lower court and Supreme Court justice in New Jersey. But the truth is, you really could not have predicted who he became. And it's not clear that the justice who started in 1956 necessarily would have predicted the direction that he went in.
All right, let me ask the tougher question then. Now that you've had a chance to absorb as much as you can, and obviously some of the response from the larger community, in essence, is there a single experience or characteristic of Brennan's that explains who he became when he went on the court?
I think that to understand Justice Brennan, you really do have to understand his life, his upbringing in New Jersey. He spent his first 50 years in New Jersey. The biggest influence on him was really his father, William J. Brennan, an Irish immigrant, a stationary fireman in a Newark brewery who became a union leader and a very popular city politician.
Let me say, there were other Irish Catholic judges on the bench in New Jersey at the time Eisenhower made his choice. Do we know why he focused in on Brennan?
The focus on Brennan was multifaceted. One piece of it certainly was the fact that he was Catholic and the notion that that might help him in re-election. But President Eisenhower was also looking at a couple of other factors, one being he wanted someone with experience as a lower court judge, whether at the state or federal level, and another factor was age. He wanted someone who was relatively youthful. Justice Brennan, at the time he was selected, was 50 years old, the same age as now Justice Elena Kagan as she takes the bench.
Nicole, you told me you were born in Harrisburg, so you're not a child of New Jersey. Have you been surprised as you have absorbed the extent to which much of the reaction here is our own surprise that New Jersey as a state hasn't paid much attention to Justice Brennan? Does that surprise you?
It does surprise me a little bit, simply because oftentimes one's home state likes to hold one up as a pillar of success and an example of what that state can produce.
Even some places, mediocrities are held up as great just because they came from the home state.
Exactly. But, you know, I think one of the things that often comes up, particularly living in Washington, one of the things that often comes up whenever there is a new Supreme Court nominee, we often banter back and forth about how much is the rest of America paying attention to this, because, you know, we're in somewhat of a bubble in Washington, and so we're very focused on these issues of the court. And so sometimes when you think of it from that perspective, perhaps it's not so surprising that people back here in his home state who've had other issues to focus on have not paid quite as much attention to the work that he's done as a Supreme Court justice.
Now, Bernie, not only are you from Florida, but in teaching law school, you're teaching human beings in the process of transition from non-lawyerhood to lawyerhood, just becoming aware. What is your reaction to the extent to which there seems to have been a sort of muted understanding of Brennan, not just because he was from New Jersey, but from New Jersey with this tremendous impact?
Well, I do think it's actually a little bit odd that he's not better known here, and I think part of the reason may be that in some sense he's been viewed as a national figure and has been a national figure since the 1950s. So while he actually did a lot in New Jersey, he was intimately involved with Arthur Vanderbilt in reconstructing the New Jersey judicial system. You know, that was a long time ago, and you know, I think a lot of people just memories just don't run back that far. So I am a little bit surprised by that, and I can't say that I necessarily focus on justice being from New Jersey in teaching, either constitutional law or other classes.
Seth, the question of ideological tests for justices has become more intense, certainly post-Bork, but certainly there's a different ideological vetting process now than was taking place in the Eisenhower years. But if during the entire century, the last century, I mean, there had been an intense ideological vetting process for new justices, do you think there's any time in the century when Justice Brennan could have been appointed if there'd been a sense of where he was going and how he would grow judicially?
Well, it depends on, is it the Justice Brennan of 1956 or the Justice Brennan of 1990 when he retired? At the time, he was viewed as a moderate Democrat, and so he would have passed an ideological test at that time.
Did the time change, or did he evolve?
I think that the heart of who he was didn't change, but he became a more passionate, aggressive jurist as time went on. But I think it would be hard for someone such as himself to get on the court now if, in terms of the justice who he was during his tenure.
What was the first inkling as you've looked back at his career? Once on the court, what's the first sign to say, aha, now I see the sparkle which is going to emerge into this star of a given point of view?
Actually, you saw it by the end of his first term. There was a series of cases that he was involved with. He had some very high-profile assignments from Chief Justice Warren, and by the end of the term in July 1957, a lot of media outlets were saying, hey, this guy is a liberal. He's lining up with the liberal bloc. Maybe Eisenhower, this isn't what he intended. So there was that sense, even on his first term, that was the case.
Nicole, is there anybody on the court now that you think has the potential to shine the way that Brennan has in terms of molding the court into the future? And I guess there are two parts to that. One is anybody that you would agree with, and even if you didn't agree with it, somebody who you think will emerge with the same stature in terms of impact long term.
That's a law school type question, Raymond.
Okay, Bernie, Nicole wants to give you that question. Go ahead, take a shot. I don't think anything's beyond you.
I would have to say that I think Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg certainly is seen as one of the more liberal justices. I think in terms of looking at her various opinions and her particular jurisprudence, I think she has thinkings that are in line with Justice Brennan, and I think that she is one to continue to look at as being one of the now and continued champions of liberal issues.
But her length of service may not be quite as significant, and she served in a different era.
Yes.
Bernie, from the strength of your laugh, I have a sense that you have an answer to that question. Is there anybody on the current court who you think has the potential to have as profound an impact as Brennan did on the court?
Well, I think, as you point out, longevity has a lot to do with it, and I suppose the new Justice Kagan may have that sort of influence.
What do you see in Justice Kagan that makes you think that?
Well, I suppose I don't know her all that well, but certainly anyone who can get people together at Harvard Law School to agree on curriculum reform is a great diplomat. And so I think to some extent what Justice Brennan's strength was being likable, being someone who could talk easily with people who might not have been inclined to agree with him and to be able to persuade them. And I think Justice Kagan may have that quality if you judge it from her ability to kind of bring people of different persuasions together at Harvard.
Bernie, let me give I want to give Seth a chance for the last word. Sometimes authors fall in love with their subjects, and sometimes they grow disenchanted. Did either of those happen as you got deeper into an understanding of Justice Brennan?
I really tried to take, and my co-author and I both tried to take, a middle-of-the-road approach, neither hero worship nor attack on the justice.
But your heart and soul weren't moved in either direction, either by repulsion or attraction, as you got to know this person.
I think he was a remarkable human being, and everyone who got to know him, whether they agreed with him or not, agreed with that he was a really special person.
Did you feel that going in, or was it felt more intensely by you as you emerged from this project?
That's something that I learned as I learned more about him.
Well, with my thanks to Seth Stern, Professor Bernard Bell, and Nicole, Austin-Hillery. That's it for this edition of Due Process, but we'll be back next week with more on Justice Brennan, the judicial philosophy that made him not just a hero of the left, but a lightning rod for the right. There should be some fireworks, so you'll want to join us next week and find us on the web at njn.net/dueprocess. For Sandy and all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
To Justice Brennan, the law was not just a command, it was a promise. It was a promise whose true fulfillment is equal justice. That promise consistently informed his many opinions on the court, the many cases in which he managed to get 5 justices to agree. And he always said the main rule around here is learning how to count to 5. His writings for the Supreme Court held that due process of law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt in all criminal cases. You all know about the presumption of innocence. That's Justice Brennan.
Major funding for due process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSCG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.